The night sky over Baghdad erupted in a dazzling, terrifying spectacle of precision and power. Television viewers around the world watched in real time as green-tinted night vision cameras captured anti-aircraft fire, arcing uselessly into the darkness, while laser-guided bombs plunged with surgical accuracy onto their targets. It was January 17, 1991, the moment warfare changed forever. Operation Desert Storm began not as a revolution in military affairs, but as a response to naked aggression. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had ordered his Republican Guard to storm across the border into Kuwait, conquering the small oil-rich emirate in less than 2 days. The world watched in shock as Iraq's powerful army of nearly 1 million soldiers and thousands of Soviet-built tanks threatened to continue south toward Saudi Arabia's vast oil fields, potentially giving Saddam control over 40% of the world's petroleum reserves. The Iraqi invasion represented the first major test of the post-Cold War international order, noted military historian Rick Atkinson in his Pulitzer Prize-winning account of the conflict. The United States and Soviet Union were no longer locked in proxy battles across the globe, creating space for regional powers to test boundaries. Within hours of the invasion, President George H.W. Bush declared, "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." Drawing on his experience as a World War II naval aviator, former CIA director, and skilled diplomat, Bush assembled a remarkable coalition of 39 nations. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 678, demanding Iraq's immediate withdrawal from Kuwait. When Saddam refused to comply, General Norman Schwarzkopf began assembling a formidable force in Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Shield, the defensive deployment to prevent further Iraqi advances, was underway. For 5 months, the United States and its allies constructed an imposing military presence in the Desert Kingdom. More than 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, hundreds of ships, and over 2,800 combat aircraft prepared for what military planners feared could become a bloody confrontation with the world's fourth-largest army. Lieutenant General Charles Horner, commander of U.S. and Allied air forces, worked alongside his planning team to craft what would become the most sophisticated air campaign in military history. They targeted Iraqi command and control centers, air defenses, electrical grids, communications networks, and transportation infrastructure. The plan represented a radical departure from previous air campaigns that had focused primarily on destroying enemy forces directly. "We weren't just planning to bomb military targets," explained Colonel John Warden, one of the campaign's chief architects. "We were designing a systematic attack on the Iraqi regime's ability to function as a modern state." As 1990 drew to a close, the United Nations passed Resolution 678, giving Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait or face military action. When the deadline passed without Iraqi compliance, coalition forces were ready. In the pre-dawn hours of January 17th, 8 Apache helicopters from the Army's 101st Airborne Division crossed into Iraqi airspace. Their mission? Destroy 2 early warning radar stations to open a corridor for the incoming air armada. At precisely 2:38 a.m. local time, the Apaches unleashed Hellfire missiles that obliterated the radar sites, creating a 20-mile-wide blind spot in Iraq's air defense network. What followed was unprecedented in warfare. Within the first 24 hours, coalition forces flew more than 2,500 sorties. F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters, appearing as ghostly triangular silhouettes, penetrated Baghdad's defenses to deliver laser-guided bombs with pinpoint accuracy. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, navigated complex routes to strike targets in the heart of the Iraqi capital. Television correspondents in Baghdad's Al-Rashid Hotel broadcast the opening salvos live to a global audience. For the first time, war unfolded in real time on television screens worldwide. The precision of the attacks and the relatively minimal collateral damage represented a new paradigm in warfare, one that would forever change how military planners approached conflict in the modern age. Dawn broke over the Persian Gulf on January 18, 1991, revealing a war unlike any other in history. As the sun rose over the desert, coalition aircraft were already completing their Third wave of strikes. General Horner's carefully orchestrated air campaign was unfolding with devastating efficiency. The strategy was built around a concept military theorists called parallel warfare, striking multiple target systems simultaneously rather than sequentially. Previous air campaigns had focused on gaining air superiority before attacking ground forces and infrastructure. Desert Storm's planners reversed this thinking, attacking everything at once in an effort to induce strategic paralysis in the Iraqi command structure. Colonel Richard Snake White, an F-15E Strike Eagle pilot who flew multiple missions during the first week, later recalled, "We weren't just destroying targets, we were destroying their entire ability to respond. By the third day, we owned the skies and could fly almost anywhere with impunity." Iraqi pilots who attempted to challenge coalition aircraft quickly discovered the technological gap between their Soviet-built MiGs and the advanced American fighters. Within the first week, over half of Iraq's air force fled to neighboring Iran, preferring internment to certain destruction. The rest remained grounded or were systematically eliminated by F-15 Eagles equipped with sophisticated radar and beyond visual range missiles. The technological disparity was staggering, wrote defense analyst Anthony Kordsman in his assessment for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Coalition forces employed systems that represented a generational leap beyond Iraq's arsenal. The campaign's precision stemmed from revolutionary technologies making their combat debut. Global Positioning System, GPS satellites, provided unprecedented navigational accuracy. Laser-guided bombs, directed by targeting pods mounted on aircraft, could hit targets with 10-foot accuracy from altitudes above Iraqi air defenses. Infrared and night vision systems allowed continuous operations regardless of weather or lighting conditions. One of the most iconic weapons of the conflict, the GBU-27 Bunker Buster, demonstrated this new precision paradigm. On February 10th, F-117s targeted what intelligence believed was a hardened command bunker in Baghdad's Al-Firdos district. The 2,000-pound bombs penetrated several feet of reinforced concrete before detonating precisely where planned. Only later did coalition officials learn the facility also sheltered hundreds of civilians, resulting in significant casualties and forcing a re-evaluation of targeting policies for downtown Baghdad. Meanwhile, electronic warfare aircraft like the EA-6B Prowler and EF-111 Raven blanketed Iraqi radar sites with sophisticated jamming signals, effectively blinding their operators. Wild Weasel aircraft specifically targeted air defense sites, firing anti-radiation missiles that homed in on radar emissions. The message to Iraqi radar operators became clear: turn on your equipment and die. The systematic dismantling of Iraq's integrated air defense system represented the most sophisticated application of electronic warfare yet seen, noted an assessment in Jane's Defense Weekly published in March 1991. By the end of the first week, the coalition had achieved near-total air supremacy. Iraqi forces, cut off from central command and under constant aerial surveillance, found themselves unable to maneuver without detection. Supply lines withered under persistent attacks, and frontline units reported receiving less than 30% of required food, fuel, and ammunition. For the first time in modern warfare, precision air power was proving capable of not just supporting ground operations, but fundamentally shaping the battlefield before troops engaged. Intelligence estimates suggested Iraqi forces in Kuwait were already suffering significant degradation, with combat effectiveness reduced by nearly 40% through air attacks alone. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described the strategy succinctly. "Our plan is simple. First, we're going to cut it off, then we're going to kill it." By the end of January, after 2 weeks of relentless bombing, the plan was working. Coalition aircraft had flown over 40,000 sorties, dropping more than 88,000 tons of bombs. Iraqi military communications were in shambles. Power production had fallen by nearly 80%, and frontline troops were increasingly isolated from their command structure. The stage was set for the next phase of the operation. As February began, coalition ground forces prepared to capitalize on the unprecedented advantage created by the air campaign, an advantage purchased through technological superiority, meticulous planning, and the dawning of a new era in warfare. where precision could potentially replace mass as the decisive factor in military operations. By early February 1991, the focus of coalition air operations shifted decisively toward Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard divisions. Positioned in southern Iraq and northern Kuwait, these forces represented Iraq's most capable military units, the regime's insurance policy against both external threats and internal coups. The Republican Guard was never just a military formation, explained Middle East analyst Kenneth Pollock. It was the backbone of Saddam's regime security apparatus, equipped with the best weapons, manned by the most loyal troops, and commanded by officers chosen for their loyalty rather than competence. Armed with Soviet-built T-72 tanks and supported by heavy artillery, the Republican Guard had spearheaded the invasion of Kuwait 6 months earlier. Now these same forces were being systematically dismantled from above. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, emerged as the Republican Guard's most feared adversary. Originally designed during the Cold War to destroy Soviet tank columns, the ungainly aircraft found its perfect mission in the Kuwaiti desert. Flying low and slow, A-10 pilots unleashed devastating fire from their 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannons, each depleted uranium round capable of penetrating a T-72's armor. Captain Martha McSally, one of the A-10 pilots who flew multiple missions against Iraqi armor, later described the experience. You could see the tanks clearly, even their tracks in the sand. When you fired the cannon, the aircraft would actually slow down from the recoil. After a strafing run, you'd look back and see vehicles burning. This context is drawn from McSally's interview with Air Force magazine published in April 1992. The psychological impact on Iraqi forces proved as damaging as the physical destruction. Lieutenant General Walter Boomer, commander of Marine Forces, reported that Iraqi prisoners consistently cited air attacks as their primary reason for surrendering. They described waiting in terror, never knowing when or where the next strike would come, Boomer noted in his after-action report. To locate and target Iraqi units, the coalition deployed an unprecedented array of surveillance assets. The E-8, Joint STARS, Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, still in development when the war began, provided real-time tracking of ground vehicles over vast areas. U-2 spy planes and RC-135 rivet joint aircraft monitored Iraqi communications, while satellites provided imagery intelligence. We could detect when they moved, when they refueled, even when they cooked meals, recalled Air Force intelligence. Officer Major James Blackwell. The Iraqis had nowhere to hide. By mid-February, the Republican Guard's combat effectiveness had diminished dramatically. Intelligence estimates suggested that some units had lost up to 70% of their armored vehicles and heavy weapons. Those that remained were forced to disperse widely to avoid detection, further reducing their combat effectiveness. The few Iraqi attempts to counter coalition air superiority ended in disaster. On February 25th, an Iraqi Scud missile struck a U.S. Army barracks in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killing 28 American soldiers, the deadliest single attack on coalition forces during the conflict. The response was swift and overwhelming, with additional resources diverted to the Scud hunt that had already consumed considerable attention from Special Operations Forces and strike aircraft. For the Iraqi soldiers on the receiving end of this aerial onslaught, the experience was apocalyptic. Private Mahmoud al-Jabouri, a Republican Guard tank gunner captured in late February, told his interrogators, "We began to believe Allah himself had joined the Americans. The bombs fell day and night with such precision. We could not move, could not resupply, could not even leave our positions to relieve ourselves without fear of death from above." As February drew to a close, reconnaissance photography revealed a startling sight: vast vehicle graveyards where Iraqi armor had been systematically destroyed. In what later became known as the Highway of Death, coalition aircraft caught retreating Iraqi forces on the highway between Kuwait City and Basra, destroying hundreds of vehicles in a matter of hours. The Republican Guard, once the pride of Iraq's military and the backbone of Saddam's power, had been reduced to scattered, isolated units with limited combat capability. The ground campaign would soon begin, but in many ways the decisive battle had already been won in the air. General Schwarzkopf, reviewing reconnaissance images of decimated Iraqi positions, reportedly remarked to his staff, "The air campaign has already done what it took weeks of ground combat to achieve in previous wars." For military theorists and planners, the implications were profound. The systematic degradation of the Republican Guard demonstrated that precision air power could neutralize even the most capable ground forces before they ever engaged in direct combat. A revelation that would shape military doctrine for decades to come. At exactly 4 a.m. on February 24, 1991, radio operators across the Kuwaiti border received a simple message: G-Day is here. After 38 days of aerial bombardment, coalition ground forces began their assault into occupied Kuwait and southern Iraq. What military planners had anticipated might be a bloody, difficult campaign unfolded instead as one of the most lopsided victories in modern warfare. General Schwarzkopf's ground strategy had been carefully concealed from Iraqi intelligence. While Saddam's forces expected a frontal assault directly into Kuwait, culminating in a marine amphibious landing along the coast, the main coalition thrust would come from an entirely different direction. The Hail Mary play, as Schwarzkopf described it, involved the U.S. Army's 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps executing a massive left hook maneuver through the western Iraqi desert, a region Saddam had left largely undefended because he considered it too remote and inhospitable for major military operations. Sergeant First Class Anthony Stewart of the 1st Infantry Division recalled the moment his unit crossed into Iraq. "We'd been told to expect fierce resistance, but we rolled across the border and just kept going. The few Iraqi troops we encountered were already waving white flags or hiding in bunkers." The coalition ground assault represented a revolution. In maneuver warfare, GPS-equipped vehicles navigated precisely through featureless desert. M1A1 Abrams tanks, with thermal imaging sights and depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds, engaged and destroyed Iraqi T-72s at ranges exceeding 2 miles, well beyond the effective range of Iraqi tank guns. Colonel Gregory Fontenot, commander of the 1st Infantry Division's 1st Battalion 34th Armor, later wrote, "We could see them long before they could see us. It wasn't a battle, it was a shooting gallery." This information appears in Fontenot's official after-action report, filed with Central Command in March 1991. Meanwhile, Marine forces pushed directly north into Kuwait, fixing Iraqi defensive positions while the Army's flanking maneuver developed. The 1st Marine Division encountered some of the stiffest resistance of the campaign at an abandoned airfield near the Bergen oil fields, where entrenched Iraqi forces fought desperately for several hours before being overwhelmed. Throughout the theater, coalition forces reported the same phenomenon: large numbers of Iraqi soldiers surrendering without firing a shot. Captain Russell Annard, who commanded a Marine company, described encountering an entire Iraqi battalion attempting to surrender to his unit's unmanned aerial drone. "They were waving white flags at a tiny aircraft buzzing overhead," Annard reported. "When we arrived, over 300 soldiers immediately threw down their weapons. Their commander told me through an interpreter that they'd been without food for days and had been told the Americans would torture or kill them if captured. When we gave them water and MREs, many of them wept." For Iraqi commanders, the situation rapidly deteriorated into chaos. The coalition's destruction of communication networks meant many units had no contact with higher headquarters. Some received contradictory orders, others received no orders at all. With coalition aircraft dominating the skies, any attempt to reposition forces invited immediate attack from above. Perhaps nowhere was the one-sided nature of the conflict more evident than in the Battle of 73 Easting. On February 26th, elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment unexpectedly encountered the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard. What followed became known as the last great tank battle of the 20th century. Despite being outnumbered, American forces destroyed more than 80 Iraqi tanks and 60 armored personnel carriers in less than half an hour, while sustaining only minor casualties. Captain H.R. McMaster, commanding Eagle Troop during the engagement, later described how thermal sights allowed his tankers to engage Iraqi vehicles through a sandstorm at night, conditions that rendered the Iraqi forces effectively blind. The campaign's third day, It had become evident that Iraqi forces were collapsing faster than coalition units could advance to accept their surrender. The vaunted Republican Guard was in full retreat toward Basra, with American armored divisions in close pursuit. Kuwait City was liberated by Arab coalition forces, its citizens pouring into the streets to celebrate, despite the ecological disaster of burning oil wells that painted the sky black with smoke. President Bush, monitoring reports from the White House, made the consequential decision to end the ground war after exactly 100 hours. At 8 a.m. on February 28th, a ceasefire took effect. Some military commanders, particularly Schwarzkopf, expressed private frustration at not being allowed to complete the destruction of retreating Republican Guard units. But the political objectives had been achieved. Kuwait was liberated, and Iraq's military power had been decisively broken. The human cost of the ground campaign was startlingly imbalanced. Coalition forces suffered fewer than 200 combat deaths, while conservative estimates placed Iraqi military casualties at over 20,000, with another 60,000 taken prisoner. As one British officer reportedly commented, "It wasn't a war, it was a harvest." As the dust settled over the Kuwaiti desert in March 1991, military analysts worldwide began assessing what many were calling a revolution in military affairs. Operation Desert Storm had demonstrated concepts that would fundamentally alter strategic thinking about modern warfare. The conflict represented the first full-scale implementation of airland battle doctrine, a concept developed in the 1980s envisioning deep strikes against enemy rear echelons while simultaneously engaging frontline forces. What had begun as theoretical discussions among military intellectuals had been validated in the most convincing manner possible. What we witnessed was not merely a victory, but the emergence of a new paradigm, wrote defense analyst Elliot Cohen in his influential assessment published in Foreign Affairs. The integration of precision weapons, stealth technology, and real-time intelligence created possibilities that simply didn't exist in previous conflicts. The statistical evidence was compelling. During World War II, it had typically required hundreds of bomber sorties and thousands of unguided bombs to destroy a single high-value target. In Vietnam, American aircraft had dropped an average of 176 tons of bombs for each confirmed strike on a bridge. During Desert Storm, a single F-117 armed with two 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs could reliably destroy two separate targets in one mission. This transformation extended beyond mere efficiency. The ability to strike precisely had strategic implications for how wars could be fought. Rather than gradually eroding enemy forces through attrition, precision air power could target critical nodes, command centers, power stations, communication hubs, potentially paralyzing an adversary's ability to coordinate resistance. Lieutenant General Michael Short, who served as Horner's deputy during the campaign, later reflected, "We demonstrated that you could achieve strategic effects without necessarily having to defeat the enemy's fielded forces first. That's a revolutionary concept." The technological elements enabling this revolution had converged for the first time during Desert Storm. Stealth aircraft defeated radar detection. Precision-guided munitions struck within feet of their aim points. Satellite communications provided unprecedented command and control capabilities. Together, these innovations allowed coalition forces to attack simultaneously across all dimensions of the battle space, a concept strategists called full-spectrum dominance. For the Pentagon's leadership, the lessons were clear. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney commissioned a detailed study of the campaign's technological aspects, focusing particularly on the performance of precision-guided munitions. The resulting document became the foundation for massive investments in smart weapons technology throughout the 1990s. Desert Storm marked the beginning of the end for mass armies and unguided munitions, observed retired General William Odom, former director of the National Security Agency. Any nation hoping to challenge American power would now have to find asymmetric approaches or invest billions in similar technologies. The psychological dimensions of the air campaign also attracted significant attention. Iraqi soldiers had described the helplessness of being under constant surveillance and precision attack. Many reported that the simple sound of aircraft overhead was enough to trigger mass desertion. This context is drawn from interviews conducted by the Rand Corporation with Iraqi prisoners of war in April 1991. Brigadier General Richard Neal, Central Command spokesman during the conflict, summarized this effect. "We told them exactly what we were going to bomb, when we were going to bomb it, and how thoroughly we would destroy it. Then we did exactly what we promised. The psychological impact cannot be overstated." Not all assessments were entirely positive, however. Some critics noted that despite its technological sophistication, the air campaign had failed to eliminate Iraq's mobile Scud missile launchers or to locate many of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction programs. These capabilities gaps would later prove consequential during the Second Gulf War in 2003. Others pointed to the conflict's limited strategic outcome. While Kuwait had been liberated and Iraq's military power severely degraded, Saddam Hussein remained in power, a situation that would trouble American policymakers for the next 12 years. Nevertheless, Operation Desert Storm represented a watershed moment in military history. The precision revolution had arrived, and warfare would never be the same. Military forces worldwide scrambled to absorb the lessons of the conflict, while defense industries reoriented toward the technologies that had proven so decisive in the Kuwaiti desert. As General Merrill McPeak, Air Force Chief of Staff during the conflict, later testified before Congress, "What we saw in Desert Storm was not just a victory, but a glimpse of the future of warfare, a future where precision and information dominance matter more than mass, and where technological superiority can effectively substitute for numerical advantage." The columns of black smoke rising from Kuwait's burning oil wells provided a fitting visual metaphor for Operation Desert Storm's complicated legacy. While tactically brilliant and operationally decisive, the conflict created consequences that would reverberate across the Middle East for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, President Bush enjoyed approval ratings above 90%, the highest ever recorded for an American president. The swift victory had seemingly exorcised the ghosts of Vietnam, restoring American confidence in military power and willingness to exercise it abroad. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney summed up the prevailing sentiment. "The American military," he declared, "is back." For military institutions worldwide, Desert Storm triggered frantic reassessments of doctrine, technology, and force structure. The Russian General Staff established a special commission to examine why Soviet-built equipment had performed so poorly against Western systems. European defense ministries accelerated plans to transition from conscript to professional forces, optimized for high-technology warfare. Middle Eastern states embarked on massive arms procurement programs, seeking the precision weapons that had proven so decisive. Every significant military in the world spent the 1990s trying to understand and adapt to what they saw in those 100 hours of ground combat, noted military historian H.R. McMaster, who had himself commanded a tank company during the conflict. The American defense industry emerged as the war's clearest economic beneficiary. Foreign military sales skyrocketed as nations sought the weapon system showcased during the conflict. Between 1991 and 1995, U.S. arms exports nearly doubled, with particular demand for precision-guided munitions, advanced aircraft, and command and control systems. Journalist Bob Woodward, in his book, The Commanders, observed that Desert Storm had essentially served as the world's largest arms exposition, with actual combat footage replacing the traditional product demonstrations. Yet beneath these apparent successes lay troubling developments. The decision to end the ground war after 100 hours, while politically expedient, left Saddam Hussein in power and able to brutally suppress uprisings by Kurdish and Shiite populations who had been encouraged to rebel by American rhetoric. The images of Republican Guard helicopters, which coalition forces had been ordered not to engage after the ceasefire, attacking civilian populations, created a moral stain on an otherwise clean military victory. For ordinary Iraqis, the war's aftermath brought new suffering. International sanctions intended to pressure Saddam's regime instead decimated the civilian economy. The destruction of power plants, water treatment facilities, and other infrastructure led to public health crises. By some estimates, more Iraqi civilians died from disease and malnutrition in the 5 years following Desert Storm then perished during the actual conflict. This information is based on United Nations humanitarian assessments conducted between 1991 and 1996. The continued American military presence in Saudi Arabia, originally intended as temporary but gradually becoming permanent, created deep resentment among religious conservatives in the kingdom. Among those outraged was a Saudi construction magnate's son named Osama bin Laden, who began publicly criticizing the presence of infidel forces near Islam's holiest sites. This grievance would later feature prominently in Al-Qaeda's justifications for terrorist attacks against American targets. Strategically, Desert Storm's decisive outcome led American policymakers to dangerous conclusions about the utility and ease of military force. What some called the Desert Storm syndrome created expectations that future conflicts could be won quickly, with minimal casualties and clear exit strategies. This thinking would prove tragically misguided in later interventions in Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq itself. General Anthony Zinni, who would later serve as commander of Central Command, warned, "We learned the wrong lessons from Desert Storm. We came to believe that technology could substitute for strategy, that overwhelming force could overcome any political problem." Perhaps most significantly, the conflict's unfinished business, with Iraq created what amounted to a state of semi-permanent war. No-fly zones established over northern and southern Iraq required continuous patrol by American and British aircraft. Periodic airstrikes targeted Iraqi air defense systems that threatened these patrols. Economic sanctions remained in place, requiring international enforcement. All these factors combined to create what historian Andrew Bakovich called the Long War, a continuous military engagement that would ultimately culminate in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified partly by unresolved issues dating back to Desert Storm. For military professionals studying air campaign design, however, Operation Desert Storm remains the gold standard, a nearly perfect integration of technology, doctrine, and execution. Air Force academies worldwide still teach the conflict as the textbook example of how to achieve air supremacy and use it to shape the battlefield. Colonel John Warden, one of the air campaign's principal architects, perhaps best summarized Desert Storm's place in military history. What the Blitzkrieg was to land warfare, what carrier aviation was to naval warfare, the integrated air campaign of Desert Storm was to modern joint operations, a watershed that fundamentally altered how advanced nations conceptualize and execute warfare. As the 20th century drew to a close, that revolution, born in the desert skies over Iraq and Kuwait, continued to transform military thought and practice around the globe, establishing precision as the new paradigm of American military power and creating both opportunities and temptations that would shape international relations for generations to come.